Welcome to our Understanding Lobbying series. Today, we'll be focusing on the source of funding disclosure requirements for client filers. A source of funding report requires client filers who meet the expenditure threshold to disclose each source who contributed more than $2,500 to the client filer to fund, in whole or in part, the client filer's activities or operations. Here are the citations to the relevant sections of law and our regulations that relate to source of funding. What is the purpose behind the law? Simply put, source of funding disclosure is intended to inform the public about the actual entities and individuals who fund lobbying campaigns in New York State. Critical to understanding how to comply with the source of funding law and requirements is understanding key terms and definitions like client filer, beneficial client, and expenditure threshold. A client filer is a lobbyist that lobbies on their own behalf, or a beneficial client. A beneficial client is the specific individual or organization on whose behalf and at whose request lobbying activity is conducted. If you lobby on your own behalf, you are your own beneficial client. And a beneficial client may also be the contractual client. To meet the expenditure threshold, the client filer must spend more than $15,000 in New York State in reportable lobbying compensation and/or expenses during the expenditure threshold, and the reportable compensation and expenses are at least 3% of the client filer's total expenditures during the threshold period. Source of funding requirements seek to shine the light on who is funding a client's lobbying activity, who is behind the lobbying campaigns you see in the media or in print or on billboards. Again, source of funding disclosure is intended to provide the public with more information regarding the actual entities and individuals who support lobbying campaigns in New York State. It is about transparency. If you are a client filer, you are required to file a source of funding form. A source of funding form is tied to the client semi-annual report. Please note that client filers are required to submit a source of funding disclosure even if the client semi-annual report is auto-generated by the lobbying application. Today, we'll provide you with a roadmap to follow for the best way to file your source of funding form and, if applicable, to disclose your sources of funding. Not all client filers have to report their sources, but all client filers must file a source of funding form by choosing a summary statement indicating whether they are 1. Required to report, or 2. Not required to report because the beneficial client is a 501c3 or government organization. 3. Not required to report because the beneficial client had no applicable contributions. 4. Not required to report because the beneficial client is under the spending threshold. And 5. Not required to report because there's an exemption pending or previously approved. This is a key point to understand, and it bears repeating. Not all client filers will be required to actually disclose their sources of funding, but all client filers must submit a source of funding form and choose the applicable summary statement, as discussed earlier. Answering the following 4 questions is the best route to take to help you determine which of the 5 summary statements you should select on your source of funding form. Question 1. Are you a 501c3 or government entity? Have you received or asked for a source of funding exemption? If yes to either question, you do not need to disclose sources. Choose the appropriate statement and submit the source of funding form. Question 2. Are you the type of entity that receives contributions as defined in Part 938.2 of the Source of Funding Regulations? If no, you do not need to disclose sources. Choose the appropriate statement and submit the source of funding form. If yes, you need to determine if you exceeded the expenditure threshold. Please note that we will provide more detail about how to determine if you exceeded the expenditure threshold later in this presentation. Back to question 3. Did you exceed the expenditure threshold? If no, you do not need to disclose sources. Choose the appropriate statement and submit the source of funding form. If yes, you need to determine if you received contributions over $2,500. Question 4. If you exceeded the threshold, did you receive contributions of more than $2,500? If no, you do not need to disclose sources. Choose the appropriate statement and submit the source of funding form. If yes, you are required to report your sources. Once again, choose the appropriate statement and submit the source of funding form. To reiterate, this screenshot illustrates what the source of funding summary statement appears like in the online application, or LA. As a reminder, not everyone has to report sources. However, all client filers must file a source of funding form and select one of these 5 options. Please note that a client semi-annual report will not submit unless client filers submit their source of funding summary statement form. This includes client filers that lobby on their own behalf and whose CSA is auto-generated in the lobbying application. Now let's take a deeper dive and examine each of the summary statements in more detail. Stops 1 and 2 on the roadmap are relatively short and relate to whether the client filer is a 501c3 government entity or has requested or been granted an exemption. If your organization is a 501c3 or government organization, or if your organization has applied for an exemption with the Commission or has received an approved exemption, you do not need to report any sources. Simply choose the appropriate statement in the drop-down, take a look at the yellow highlights, and you are all done. Stop 3 on the roadmap is where you determine whether or not you receive contributions. This slide describes in detail what a contribution is. A contribution is defined as any payment to or for the benefit of the client filer and which is intended to fund in whole or in part the client filer's activities or operations. If your organization is the type of entity that does not receive contributions as defined, then you can select Not Required to Report, Beneficial Client Had No Applicable Contributions. Examples of entities that are likely to not receive contributions are Amazon or DoorDash, as both entities are receiving payments for goods or services. It is also important to understand what is not a contribution. Contribution does not mean a payment in exchange for goods or services rendered or delivered directly to the individual or entity making the payment. Again, an example of this is a payment for goods or services. Entities like Amazon receives payments for goods, and these payments are not considered a contribution for source of funding purposes. Contribution also does not include payments that are specifically earmarked for non-lobbying activity. A payment that is earmarked and conditioned by the payor for use for a specific purpose other than lobbying in New York, and B, is kept in a segregated bank account solely for the specific non-lobbying purpose and unavailable for general operating expenses. There are 2 reasons a client filer would select the statement Not Required to Report, Beneficial Client Had No Applicable Contributions. 1, the client filer does not receive contributions, or 2, the client filer did not receive contributions over $2,500. If either 1 or 2 applies, choose the statement highlighted in yellow here. Note, we mentioned the second reason here since it applies, but before you determine whether you received contributions over $2,500, you should first determine if you exceeded the expenditure threshold, because if you didn't, you don't have to disclose your sources of funding, and there is no point in checking the amount of contributions you received from sources. So if you are the type of entity that receives contributions, then you should proceed down the road and next determine if you exceeded the expenditure threshold. To recap where you are on our roadmap, you have determined that you have contributions that may need to be reported. So the next stop is determining if the expenditure threshold has been met, which would require you to report those sources. The next few slides will go into more detail on how you know if the expenditure threshold has been met. What is the expenditure threshold? To meet the expenditure threshold, you or your organization must 1. Spend more than $15,000 in New York State in reportable lobbying compensation and/or expenses during the expenditure threshold period, and 2, your reportable compensation and expenses must equate to at least 3% of the organization's total expenditures during the threshold period. Key terms to understand and focus on at this point include reportable lobbying compensation and expenses and total expenditures. Reportable lobbying expenses is any cost of lobbying activity that has occurred in New York State that is not lobbyist compensation. Reportable lobbying compensation are all direct or indirect payment of salaries or other things of value provided to a lobbyist in exchange for lobbying or services for the furtherance of lobbying activity in New York State. This includes year-end bonuses, but not fringe benefits. Total expenditures is the total of any and all payments of cash or cash equivalents made in the ordinary course of business, or a charge against available funds in settlement of an obligation made in the ordinary course of business. This includes a promise to pay or a promise of a payment or a transfer of anything of value made in the ordinary course of business for goods and services that have been provided or performed. Now, if you're unsure of your total reportable lobbying compensation and expenses, review the lobbying filings you have submitted. What you reported on your bi-monthlies or client semi-annuals for compensation and expenses is what should go into this amount and will tell you whether you have spent more than $15,000 on compensation and expenses in New York State. Now that you know what the expenditure threshold is, here is how you determine if you have exceeded it. The client filer should ask the following questions. 1. Did you or your organization spend more than $15,000 in New York State in reportable lobbying compensation and/or expenses in the past 12 months, preceding and including the last day of the CSA reporting period that is attached to the required source of funding? 2. Did you or your organization spend more than $15,000 in reportable lobbying compensation and/or expenses in New York State in the calendar year, which would be January 1st to the last day of the CSA reporting period that is attached to the required source of funding? If you responded yes to either questions 1 or 2, was the reportable compensation and expenses at least 3% of your organization's total expenditures during either the applicable 12 months or calendar years? To reiterate, you can determine if you spent more than $15,000 by looking at your bimonthlies or CSAs for the relevant time period, which will reflect your reportable compensation and expenses you should use for this calculation. On our website, we have created several tools to assist you in determining if disclosure of your sources is required, including our source of funding expenditure threshold calculator shown here, which will help you determine if you have exceeded the 15,000 3% threshold. We strongly encourage you to use this helpful calculator. In addition, on our website, we have source of funding guidance materials and a source of funding flowchart. Both of these can be found in the CSA Source of Funding tab on the lobbying webpage. If you did not exceed the threshold, then you are not required to report your sources and should select Not Required to Report, Beneficial Client is Under Spending Threshold. So if you have determined you did not exceed the 15,000 3% expenditure threshold, you can stop here, submit the source of funding form as shown above, and get off the road. If you have determined you have exceeded the 15,000 3% threshold, you need to see if you received any contributions over $2,500. If yes, you are required to report your sources and must select Required to Report. If no, select Not Required to Report, No Applicable Contributions. So if the answer is no, select the yellow highlighted statement and get off the road. If the answer is yes, select the pink highlighted statement, which means you now have to actually disclose your sources of funding. To recap, at this point in the road, you have determined 1. You are not a 501c3 or government organization. 2. You have applicable contributions. 3. You exceeded the 15,000 3% spending threshold. And 4. You received contributions of over $2,500. This is the final stop, which is reporting those sources of funding. These next slides will explain what sources need to be reported and how you go about doing that. Now you need to determine what sources need to be reported. Determining that for the first CSA reporting period, which is January to June, is simpler than it may be for the second CSA reporting period that runs from July through December. First, we will look at the January through June CSA reporting period. Now, what sources must be reported for the January-June CSA reporting period? If the aggregated sum of the contributions received from a source is more than $2,500, the client filer is required to disclose each contribution received from the source in the January-June client semi-annual report. In contrast, if the aggregated sum of the contributions received from a source is $2,500 or less, then the client filer is not required to disclose any contributions received. This slide relates to the second CSA reporting period that runs from July through December and covers the scenario when you have met the expenditure threshold only for the second CSA reporting period, but not the first. If during the previous reporting period, the client filer did not meet the expenditure threshold, then no contributions received from any source during the first reporting period are added to contributions received from any source during the second reporting period. The client filer must disclose only those sources whose aggregated sum of contributions that were received during the second CSA period is more than $2,500. This slide also relates to the July-December CSA, but describes what to do when the threshold was met by the client filer for both CSA periods that year. This particular slide covers the scenario where the client filer has received contributions from a source during the July to December CSA period, but did not receive any contributions from that particular source in the first CSA period. So what sources must be reported for the July-December reporting period? If the aggregated sum of the contributions is more than $2,500, then the client filer is required to disclose each contribution received from the source in the July-December client semi-annual report. In contrast, if the aggregated sum of the contributions received from a source is $2,500 or less, then the client filer is not required to disclose any contributions received from that source in the July-December client semi-annual report. This slide also relates to the July-December CSA and describes what to do for a different scenario when the threshold was met by the client filer for both CSA periods that year. This particular slide covers the scenario where the client filer has received contributions from a source during the July to December CSA period, and that same source had contributed over $2,500 in the first CSA period. So what sources must be reported for the July-December reporting period? The client filer is required to disclose all contributions, regardless of amount, received from that same source during the July-December reporting period. This slide also relates to the July-December CSA and describes what to do when the threshold was met by the client filer for both CSA periods that year, covering yet another scenario. This particular slide covers a scenario where the client filer has received contributions from a source during the July-December CSA period and received $2,500 or less in any contributions from that same source in the first CSA period. That means, of course, that the source was not required to be disclosed in the first CSA period that year. In this case, again, when a source contributed something in the first CSA period, but it was $2,500 or less, in this case, you need to add all contributions received from that source over the course of the calendar year to see if it exceeds $2,500. So what sources must be reported for the July-December reporting period? If the aggregated sum of the contributions is more than $2,500, then the client filer is required to disclose each contribution received from the source during the calendar year in the July-December client semi-annual report. In contrast, if the aggregated sum of the contributions received from a source is $2,500 or less, then the client filer is not required to disclose any contributions received from that source during the calendar year in the July-December client semi-annual report. Here are some additional important things to note. A disclosure that identifies an intermediary or any other entity that obscures the name of the person, corporation, partnership, organization, or entity actually making the contribution does not qualify as the source. The true source must be disclosed. Client filers generally disclose payments, which basically means money, and generally do not disclose in-kind contributions except when a 501c4 receives an in-kind contributions from a 501c3 of over $2,500. Then the 501c4 must disclose the 501c3 as a source of funding. and an in-kind contribution includes donations of staff, staff time, personnel, offices, office supplies, and financial support of any kind or any other resources. So now that you are disclosing sources in general, and you know which specific sources you must disclose, what dollar amount do you report? The law provides a formula for that. Unless a contribution to a client filer is specifically designated for lobbying in New York State, in which case you would report 100% of the amount contributed, the amount of the contribution is calculated using a formula. Another key point to understand, if you receive membership dues, fees, or assessments, the dollar amount of those dues, fees, or assessments counts towards whether that particular source exceeds the $2,500 contribution threshold and must be disclosed as a source. But the amount of the dues, fees, or assessments is disclosed as $0. For example, if you receive $3,000 in membership dues from John Smith, you would disclose John Smith as one of your sources of funding, but the reportable amount of the contribution would be listed as $0. Now let's take a moment to explore the actual formula. If contributions from a source include any contribution specifically designated for lobbying in New York State, then the whole contribution amount must be reported. As we mentioned earlier, any membership dues, fees, or assessments count towards the $2,500 contribution threshold. The amount of such dues, fees, or assessments should be reported as $0, but the name of the source still needs to be reported. For any other contributions, the reportable amount of contribution is the product of the dollar amount of the contribution and the reportable compensation and expenses divided by the total expenditures. Now that you have determined what sources of funding need to be reported and the amount of contribution that needs to be reported, the final step in the process equals actually reporting your sources on the source of funding form. First, as we have already mentioned, you should select the required to report summary statement on the source of funding form as shown here. Next, to actually disclose your sources of funding, 1. Select the required to report on the source of funding form. 2. You can upload a source of funding spreadsheet that lists all of your sources by selecting the blue button that says Load, or 3. Manually add each source individually by selecting the green Add Source of Funding button. The source of funding spreadsheet can be found on the Commission website with additional information on how to fill out and complete the spreadsheet. Here are some helpful hints for completing and uploading the source of funding spreadsheet. The lobbying application, or LA, will not upload the Excel spreadsheet if there is any missing and/or invalid information. The information must be corrected on the spreadsheet before LA will allow the spreadsheet to be uploaded. If you notice a mistake, either spelling or incorrect dollar amount, after the information has been uploaded and populated, LA will allow you to correct that information. Lastly, you must use a capital Y or N when entering information in the in-kind of contribution column. In-kind contributions generally relate to 501c3 organizations providing in-kind contributions to a 501c4. For many of you, that will not apply, and if not, enter N in the appropriate column. For more details or assistance with filling out the source of funding spreadsheet, see our website or give us a call, and we will be happy to walk you through it. This is the end of our roadmap depicting how you submit your source of funding form, and if applicable, how you disclose your sources of funding. We hope you found this helpful. As mentioned throughout the presentation, please visit our website for the source of funding calculator, additional guidance materials and instructions, as well as the source of funding spreadsheet. As always, we're here to help. Call or email us anytime. Thank you for your participation today. To stay up to date with the latest colleague ethics and lobbying news and deadlines, follow us on social media.